Imagine waking up in a multi-story apartment block where the air smells of smoke, sweat, and stale bread. But you are not an ordinary Roman citizen. You are someone's property. Your name has been stripped away, replaced by whatever your master calls you. Your body belongs to another. Your labor fuels the empire, but your life can be bought, sold, or discarded at a whim. This is the hidden reality of ancient Rome, a society that celebrated philosophy, art, and engineering. But all of it rested on the backs of millions of enslaved people. From the marble streets of Rome itself, to the vineyards of Sicily, from the mines of Hispania to the kitchens of imperial palaces, slavery wasn't an afterthought. It was the foundation. Tonight, we will walk through that world, not through the eyes of emperors or senators, but through the enslaved, the cooks, the gladiators, the nurses, the field hands, the scribes, the children torn from their homelands. We'll uncover how they lived, how they were punished, how they resisted, and what freedom, if any, looked like. So, settle in. This is the story of what it was like to be a slave in ancient Rome, becoming a slave, captured, sold, forgotten. Your life as a Roman slave did not begin in Rome, it began with capture. Rome was constantly at war, and with each victory came human spoils. When Roman legions swept across Gaul, Greece, North Africa, or the Near East, they didn't just take land, they took people. Prisoners of war were rounded up by the thousands, chained, and marched to slave markets. Imagine being in one of these markets. A wooden platform, dozens of frightened men, women, and children displayed like livestock. Buyers walked around, poking muscles, inspecting teeth, judging scars. If you spoke a foreign tongue, your words meant nothing. What mattered was your age, your health, your usefulness. Rome had no shortage of demand. The city itself was teeming with over 1 million people at its peak, and as many as 1/3 were enslaved. Wealthy patricians competed to own the most, while even a modest craftsman might purchase a slave to help in his workshop. Once purchased, you might be branded. Some were tattooed with words like fugitivus, fugitive to prevent escape. Others were shackled or fitted with iron collars inscribed with their owner's name and address, like a grim version of a dog tag. And then, you were stripped of your past. Your name gone. Your family scattered. Whatever gods you once prayed to, they were replaced with the household gods of your master. You were no longer a person in Roman eyes. You were property, catalogued alongside oxen and carts. Life inside a Roman household. Not all slaves suffered in mines or fields. Many lived inside Roman households, serving the wealthy elite. But that doesn't mean their lives were easy. A wealthy Roman villa was like a machine, and slaves were the guias. Cooks woke before dawn to grind grain and bake bread. House slaves cleaned floors, polished marble, and carried water from cisterns. Others dressed their masters, oiled their skin, braided their hair. Children of the elite were raised by slaves. Greek slaves, prized for their education, often worked as tutors, teaching boys philosophy, literature, and rhetoric. Nurses breastfed infants who weren't their own. Personal attendants, known as pedisequi, followed young masters everywhere, carrying their books, sandals, or even chamber pots. But living inside a home meant living under constant surveillance. Any mistake, spilled wine, broken plate, a poorly prepared meal, could bring punishment. Slaves were beaten, whipped, or humiliated in front of others. Some households employed other slaves as enforcers, pitting enslaved people against each other. Yet, within these walls, a strange intimacy developed. Slaves were everywhere in a Roman's daily life. They heard secrets, witnessed arguments, and managed households. Masters feared betrayal, and yet they depended entirely on those they mistrusted. It was a precarious, claustrophobic world, one where your fate could turn on a master's whim. Brutal work in the fields and mines. If you were unlucky, your chains did not lead you to a villa, but to the countryside or the mines. The most brutal assignments of all. In Sicily, enslaved laborers toiled on massive estates known as latifondia. These farms grew wheat, olives, and grapes, feeding Rome's endless appetite. Overseers with whips watched over gangs of slaves, forcing them to work from sunrise to sunset. There were no breaks, no comfort, only relentless labor under the Mediterranean sun. Even worse were the mines. Gold, silver, and iron were essential to the Roman economy, and slaves were the ones who dug them out. In Spain, in Dacia, in the mountains of Anatolia, men were sent underground into narrow shafts, hacking at rock with crude tools. The air was suffocating, the risk of collapse constant, and the work itself deadly. Ancient writers like Diodorus Siculus described mine slaves as living a life full of misery, with death as the only release. Few ever made it out. Mines were essentially a death sentence. Owners simply replaced the dead with fresh captives. And yet, these unseen workers funded Rome's power. Every glittering coin in a senator's purse, every golden ornament in a temple, came at the cost of enslaved lives hidden beneath the earth. Gladiators, slaves in the arena. When we think of Roman slaves, perhaps no image is stronger than that of the gladiator. But life as a gladiator was both more glamorous and more horrific than the movies suggest. Not all gladiators were slaves. Some were free men seeking fame or pay, but many were indeed enslaved, purchased for the arenas. They were trained in special schools, living under strict regimes of diet, exercise, and combat drills. On the surface, it might look enviable compared to backbreaking field labor. Gladiators were fed well, treated by physicians, and given chances to win glory. But it was all for one purpose: entertainment. In the Colosseum, tens of thousands of Romans screamed as men fought to the death. Some battles were one-on-one duels, while others were staged spectacles, naval battles with flooded arenas, or reenactments of famous wars. Exotic animals like lions and tigers were unleashed on terrified men who stood little chance of survival. And while not every gladiator died in the ring, most fights ended before death. The constant threat of violence was inescapable. A gladiator might survive years of combat, win fame, and even be granted freedom with the symbolic wooden sword known as the rudis. But for most, the arena was just another stage for enslavement, dressed up as spectacle, the constant fear of punishment. To be a Roman slave was to live under the constant shadow of punishment. Roman law was brutally clear. A master had absolute power over his slaves. He could whip them, torture them, or even kill them without consequence. If a slave murdered his master, Roman law dictated that every slave in the household, dozens, sometimes hundreds, would be executed in retribution. Collective punishment was seen as necessary to instill fear. Some punishments were horrifyingly creative. Runaways could be branded on the forehead with hot irons. Collars inscribed with humiliating messages were locked around their necks. "Hold me, lest I flee, and return me to my master." Crucifixion, famously used for criminals, was also a punishment for rebellious slaves. Bodies lined the roads leading into Rome, a public warning not to resist, even small disobedience. Stealing food, answering back, could mean a savage beating. To live as a slave was to live in a body that was never your own, always vulnerable to pain. Children born into chains. Slavery in Rome wasn't only about war captives and foreign prisoners. A shocking number of slaves were born into bondage. Roman law declared that the child of an enslaved woman was automatically a slave, regardless of who the father was. This meant that many slave families never saw freedom. Generations lived and died in servitude. A slave mother might nurse her infant while also being forced to wet nurse the master's child. Her own baby could be sold away at any moment. In fact, Roman estates often saw infant slaves raised with the purpose of being sold as soon as they were strong enough to work. Some masters encouraged slaves to have children because it was cheaper than buying new captives. Others saw it as a nuisance, preferring to purchase strong adult workers from the markets. For the enslaved, childbirth brought little joy, because it often meant condemning a new life to the same suffering. But there were also strange ironies. Children fathered by Roman masters sometimes blurred the line between slave and free. While technically enslaved, some were shown favor, given education, or manumitted as young adults. Others, however, were denied acknowledgement and left to toil as servants in their father's house. A constant reminder of the blurred boundaries of Roman slavery, the intimate servants, bedchambers, and secrets. The closer a slave was to their master, the more dangerous their life could be. Nowhere was this clearer than in the private quarters of Roman households. Some slaves were attendants in the bedroom, dressing their masters, preparing baths, or even managing their sexual encounters. Ancient Roman culture treated enslaved bodies as commodities. Male and female slaves alike could be forced into sexual service, sometimes openly, sometimes in secrecy. This gave intimate servants a peculiar power. They heard confessions, witnessed affairs, and knew the vulnerabilities of the household. A trusted bedchamber slave could hold the keys to influence, but that same closeness meant living under immense risk. A single accusation, true or false, could bring execution. Roman satirists often joked that the slave who undressed you knew you better than your spouse. These attendants were confidants and tools at the same time, existing in a liminal space between trust and absolute control. Public slaves, Rome's invisible workforce. Not all slaves belonged to private households. Some were owned by the Roman state itself, known as servi publici, or public slaves. These men and women worked for the city of Rome, maintaining aqueducts, sweeping streets, or overseeing public baths. They could be clerks, accountants, or assistants in temples. Unlike private slaves, they were seen as a resource of the state, and in some cases, they enjoyed slightly better treatment. A skilled public slave might even handle finances, oversee archives, or manage large construction projects. But make no mistake, they were still property. Their labor maintained the grandeur of the city, but they were paid nothing. In rare cases, public slaves could earn small stipends or tips for their work, giving them a slim hope of purchasing their freedom. They were everywhere in the city, invisible and essential, keeping the machinery of empire running while free citizens congratulated themselves on their civilization. Slave markets, the business of human lives. Rome's appetite for slaves was insatiable, and the markets where they were sold were spectacles of cruelty. In bustling cities like Delos or Rome itself, traders displayed human beings on raised platforms, sometimes with placards around their necks listing their qualities. Strong worker, good cook, educated in Greek. Children were paraded beside their mothers, though they were often sold separately. The buying process was cold and transactional. Buyers inspected bodies for scars, signs of illness, or deformities. Some even made slaves walk, run, or demonstrate tasks before purchase. The sheer scale was staggering. Ancient sources claim that after some conquests, tens of thousands of captives were sold at once. These markets fueled Rome's economy, filling villas, fields, and mines with endless waves of human labor. And for the enslaved, the market was the true moment of dehumanization. You stood naked before strangers, judged like livestock, stripped of dignity before your new life of servitude even began. Educated slaves. The paradox of learning in chains. While many slaves lived lives of brute labor, some were valued for their intellect. Educated Greeks, captured during Rome's wars, were especially prized. These slaves became tutors, philosophers, secretaries, and doctors. Paradoxically, they were often better educated than their masters. A wealthy Roman senator might not be able to write elegant Greek verse, but his slave could. These intellectual slaves were the engine of Roman culture, copying manuscripts, teaching children, and preserving knowledge that would outlast Rome itself. Yet despite their skills, they were still chained. A brilliant philosopher like Epictetus, who later became famous for his Stoic teachings, began life as a slave. His master once twisted his leg until it broke, just to demonstrate his power. Education gave slaves a voice, but not freedom. They could speak eloquently, debate philosophy, and even shape their master's opinions, but they were never allowed to forget their status as property. The specter of slave rebellions. No matter how tightly Rome tried to control its slaves, rebellion always lurked in the shadows. The most famous was, of course, Spartacus. In 73 BCE, Spartacus, a gladiator slave, led a revolt of fighters who broke out of a gladiator school in Capua. What began with a handful of men snowballed into an army of tens of thousands of runaway slaves. For 2 years, they defeated Roman legions, raided villas, and sent waves of panic through the Senate. Rome eventually crushed the rebellion, crucifying 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, a grisly message to anyone who might follow. But Spartacus was not unique. Sicily saw multiple uprisings of field slaves, desperate men who had been worked beyond endurance. Each rebellion ended in massacre, but the constant eruptions showed just how fragile Rome's system really was. The empire presented itself as eternal and invincible, yet it relied on millions who longed only for freedom, a dangerous contradiction. Punishments designed to terrorize? Beyond daily beatings, Rome developed punishments meant not only to discipline but to terrify the enslaved population. Crucifixion was the most infamous, its slow agony unfolding before crowds. But there were others. Some slaves were thrown to wild animals in the arena, their deaths entertainment for citizens. Others were forced into staged executions, reenactments of myths where the punishment was real. There was even a practice called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, where slaves and criminals alike were thrown unarmed into cages with lions or leopards. These deaths weren't about justice. They were theater, designed to keep everyone in fear. It was psychological warfare. Every slave in Rome knew what could happen if they stepped out of line. The cruelty was public for a reason, to break not just bodies but spirits, the rare path to freedom. For some, there was one glimmer of hope: manumission, the granting of freedom. Masters could free slaves in their wills, rewarding loyal service. Others allowed slaves to buy their freedom, saving coins earned through tips or small allowances. Freed slaves became liberti, freedmen, who often took their former master's family name. But freedom was never absolute. A freed slave still owed loyalty and service to their ex-master, now called their patron. Freedmen couldn't hold high office, and their children bore the stigma of servile origins. Yet for many it was enough. Some freedmen rose to wealth and prominence, running businesses or serving in government posts. The poet Horace was the son of a freedman. The possibility of manumission was both a carrot to keep slaves obedient and a reminder of how narrow the path to freedom truly was. Religion, superstition, and consolation. Religion was both a comfort and a control mechanism for Roman slaves. Many brought their gods with them: Celtic deities, Egyptian spirits, Eastern cults. In the crowded quarters of slaves, these traditions mingled, forming strange hybrids. Slaves whispered prayers to household spirits, begged for protection from cruel masters, or sought magic charms against beatings. Some joined mystery religions, like the cult of Isis or Mithras, which welcomed outsiders regardless of status. These secretive groups offered community, ritual, and the hope of salvation beyond the present life. Masters, however, often used religion to keep slaves obedient. They ordered sacrifices, demanded observance of Roman rites, and claimed divine justification for their power. Religion was both resistance and control, a silent battlefield fought in shrines and whispered invocations. Slaves in Roman entertainment beyond the arena. The arena was only one stage where slaves were exploited for entertainment. They were also actors, musicians, dancers, and jesters. Some were trained from youth to perform, providing amusement at banquets. Wealthy Romans liked to show off exotic talents, an African dancer, a Greek musician, a Syrian storyteller. These enslaved entertainers lived lives that seemed glamorous, but were still bound by chains. Their performances weren't just for art, they were for the vanity of their masters. A clever slave could mock guests or tell bawdy stories, but always within limits. One wrong joke, one moment of offense, and punishment followed. Entertainment slavery was yet another reminder that Rome saw human beings not as individuals, but as tools, whether for work, for sex, or simply for laughter. Slaves in the Roman mines. A living death. If field slavery was brutal, then mine slavery was a descent into hell itself. Deep in the mountains of Spain, Gaul, and the Balkans, Rome extracted its wealth in gold, silver, copper, and iron, almost entirely on the backs of slaves. The mines were not just workplaces, but death traps. Prisoners of war, criminals, and the most disposable slaves were chained underground for years. Air was scarce, collapses were frequent, and the dust ate away at lungs. Pliny the Elder described mining as the most terrible of all human labor. Slaves lived in darkness, hacking away with crude tools. The noise, the choking dust, and the constant fear of cave-ins turned the mines into slow-motion graves. Many never saw the sun again once sent inside. For Rome, the mines were essential. They kept coins flowing, weapons forged, and monuments built. For the enslaved, they were a sentence worse than death. The cruel irony was that these men and women dug the treasure that adorned the empire, but would never taste its fruits. Household rivalries and slave hierarchies. Slavery was not just oppression from masters, it was also rivalry among slaves themselves. In wealthy households, hundreds of enslaved people might work side by side, but not equally. Some were cooks, others stable boys, others personal attendants to the master. Within this forced community, hierarchies formed. The villicus, or overseer, was often a slave himself, placed in charge of others. This gave him power, but also earned resentment. Some slaves betrayed one another to curry favor with the master, knowing that loyalty could mean survival, or even eventual freedom, but others forged bonds of solidarity. Whispered conversations in kitchens, hidden acts of defiance, small gestures of kindness. These became the invisible resistance of daily life. The household was thus a place of tension not just between master and slave, but between slaves competing in a system designed to keep them divided. Slaves in Roman fashion, dressing the empire. Clothing in Rome was a powerful symbol of status, and slaves were deeply involved in creating and maintaining it. From spinning wool and weaving cloth to dyeing fabrics and polishing togas, slaves were the unseen tailors of Roman elegance. Wealthy women had enslaved hairdressers who spent hours crafting elaborate styles with braids, pins, and jewels. Others served as ornatresses, responsible for makeup and perfumes. But irony laced every stitch. Slaves who spent their days perfecting the appearance of their masters often wore nothing more than simple tunics, sometimes barely enough to cover their bodies. They might handle silks from the East and rare purple dyes reserved for senators, but could never dream of wearing them. Fashion was another reminder that Roman grandeur was built on servitude. Every polished toga at the forum, every perfumed banquet, had been prepared by hands that were invisible, uncelebrated, and chained. Branding, collars, and the mark of ownership. Roman slavery left scars not just on the soul, but on the body itself. Some slaves were branded on the forehead with hot irons, marked permanently with the symbol of their master. Others were forced to wear iron collars inscribed with humiliating messages. I belong to my master. If you find me, return me. Runaway slaves were hunted relentlessly. Rome even had professional fugitive slave catchers who tracked escapees. Punishments for capture were horrific. Flogging, mutilation, sometimes execution. The branding and collars served a deeper purpose than control. They erased individuality, reducing human beings to property in the most visible way possible. Even freedmen bore the marks of their enslavement, long after manumission, a reminder that chains could bind the body forever, even if broken later. Slaves in Roman religion and sacrifice. Slaves weren't just laborers. They were woven into Rome's religious fabric. Some acted as assistants in temples, sweeping floors, preparing sacrifices, or carrying ritual objects. Others became sacred attendants in mystery cults, serving gods like Cybele or Isis. Their bodies were considered useful tools for the divine just as much as for their masters. In darker moments, slaves could even be used as sacrificial victims. Though rare, there are accounts of slaves being offered in religious rituals, particularly during crises when Romans sought to appease the gods. Religion thus provided both sanctuary and terror. For some slaves, temple duties gave dignity and escape from harsher work. For others, the gods demanded the same thing as the master's absolute submission: sexual exploitation and the Roman double standard. Sexual abuse was one of the most pervasive realities of Roman slavery. Roman law considered the bodies of slaves as the property of their masters, available for use without consent. Male and female slaves alike could be forced into sexual service, whether in private households, public brothels, or on command at banquets. For elite Romans, this was normalized. Philosophers, senators, even emperors openly boasted of using slaves sexually. The double standard was clear. Freeborn citizens could never be violated, but enslaved people had no protection at all. Yet, within this cruelty, there were complications. Some masters favored certain slaves as concubines, giving them privileges, jewelry, or influence. But favoritism was a gilded cage. The underlying exploitation never changed. This sexual economy was both a hidden engine of Roman households and one of the most silenced legacies of slavery, leaving countless lives marked by abuse. Slaves as doctors and healers. Not all Roman slaves swung hammers or carried loads. Some were healers. Wealthy households often owned slaves, trained as physicians, midwives, or herbalists. These medical slaves treated not just their masters, but sometimes the wider community. A skilled doctor-slave could become indispensable, enjoying privileges and even respect. But once again, status did not mean freedom. A slave doctor might save his master's life one day, and still be beaten the next. The tension was clear. Society relied on the knowledge of enslaved people, yet refused to acknowledge their humanity. Some medical slaves eventually earned freedom and set up practices as freedmen, passing their expertise to future generations. Ironically, much of Roman medicine preserved in texts and practices came from men and women who were once property. The shadow world of runaway slave communities. Despite the danger, some slaves escaped, and a few managed to stay free. In forests, mountains, and swamps, runaway slaves sometimes formed hidden communities. These groups lived as bandits, raiding estates and surviving on stolen goods. Roman authorities considered them a constant threat, describing them as latrones, robbers, but in truth they were fugitives seeking freedom at any cost. Most were eventually hunted down, but their existence shows the cracks in Rome's system. Escape, though rare, was always a possibility. Even whispers of fugitives surviving in the wild gave hope to those still chained. Freedom, however fleeting, was a powerful dream. And for the rare few who managed to vanish permanently, Rome's vastness became both prison and shield. Slaves in the Roman military machine. While slaves weren't officially part of the legions, they were everywhere around the Roman military. They carried supplies, dug fortifications, cooked meals, and cared for animals. Some acted as personal servants to officers, polishing armor, sharpening weapons, or even standing guard over camps. In desperate times, Rome did arm slaves. During major crises, like the wars against Hannibal, slaves were promised freedom in exchange for service. These ad hoc slave soldiers fought bravely, proving that desperation could turn into loyalty if the reward was freedom. Yet, such promises were rare. Most slaves in the military sphere remained invisible laborers, ensuring that Rome's armies looked glorious on the battlefield, while their own names were forgotten. Death, burial, and the afterlife of slaves. Death did not free a slave from inequality. Most enslaved people were buried in unmarked graves, their bodies treated as disposable as their labor. Without family rights or property, they rarely had tombs of their own, yet some slave communities pooled money to bury their dead with dignity. Inscriptions survive where fellow slaves honored one another with simple epitaphs. To our companion, who was like a brother. Freedmen, once slaves themselves, often built elaborate tombs to prove their new status. These monuments sometimes included references to their enslaved past, both as warnings and as triumphs. For many slaves, the afterlife was the only imagined escape. Mystery religions promised salvation beyond chains, while Stoic philosophy, often whispered in slave quarters, taught that true freedom was of the soul, not the body. The slave market. Human bodies on display. Before a slave ever began their life of servitude, there was the market. Roman slave markets were public spectacles, bustling, loud, and deeply humiliating. Men, women, and children stood on platforms while auctioneers shouted out their qualities. Young men were prized for strength, young women for beauty, and children for pliability. Slaves were often stripped naked so buyers could inspect their teeth, muscles, and skin for defects. They might be forced to walk, lift objects, or even demonstrate skills like singing or writing. Their price tags dangled from signs around their necks. Foreign slaves fetched higher prices. Gauls were admired for their strength, Greeks for their intellect, Syrians for their artistry, but all were reduced to commodities. Families were torn apart in an instant, mothers begging for their children as buyers separated them forever. For Rome, the market was routine. For the enslaved, it was the brutal moment where freedom ended, and a lifetime of uncertainty began. Slaves in entertainment, actors, performers, and musicians. While gladiators get the spotlight, many Roman slaves were entertainers of another kind. Wealthy households often owned slaves trained in music, poetry, or performance. Some were forced to sing at banquets, play instruments late into the night, or recite verses to amuse drunken guests. Others became actors in Roman theaters, performing comedies or tragedies for the amusement of crowds. Acting, however, carried stigma. In Roman culture, performers were considered morally suspect, and slaves in these roles bore double shame. They were both property and public spectacles, mocked for their roles even as audiences cheered. Musicians, on the other hand, could rise to prominence. A talented flautist or harpist might travel with their master, entertaining elite gatherings, but their skill never belonged to them. Every note was owned, every applause redirected to their master's prestige. Entertainment slaves lived paradoxical lives. They were visible, sometimes even adored, but never free. Their art was chained just as much as their bodies. Childhood in chains, the life of child slaves. Children were not spared from Rome's appetite for labor. Some were born into slavery, their mothers enslaved, ensuring the child's status was fixed at birth. Others were captured in wars or sold by desperate families in times of famine. From the youngest age, they were thrust into servitude. Child slaves performed menial tasks, fetching water, sweeping floors, or serving as attendants to other children in elite households. They became living playthings, humiliated by being dressed up, mocked, or beaten for amusement. But the fate of a child slave could vary widely. Some, if they showed intelligence, were educated alongside their master's children, groomed for skilled service. Others were condemned early to brothels, mines, or menial labor. The tragedy of child slavery was its permanence. A child growing up in chains often could not even imagine freedom. Their entire identity was shaped by subjugation, a stolen childhood that shaped stolen lives. The invisible women, female slaves in daily life. The lives of female slaves deserve special attention, because their struggles were distinct and often harsher. Women worked in kitchens, weaving workshops, or as wet nurses, raising their masters' children while their own were taken from them. Some served as hairdressers and dressers for elite Roman women, spending hours perfecting appearances. But their vulnerability went beyond labor. Female slaves were constantly exposed to sexual exploitation. Roman law gave them no protection, meaning their masters' sons, and even guests could abuse them with impunity. Despite this, women also became agents of subtle influence. A trusted maid could whisper advice to her mistress, carry secret messages, or act as a confidant. Some even shaped household politics, quietly swaying decisions behind the scenes. Their daily lives reflected the dual cruelty of Rome, not just chains of labor, but chains of gender, doubled upon one another. Educated slaves, the paradox of knowledge in chains. Among the strangest contradictions of Rome was its reliance on enslaved intellectuals. Greek slaves in particular were highly valued as tutors, philosophers, and secretaries. A wealthy Roman might have his son's entire education directed by an enslaved Greek scholar. These men could quote Homer, solve geometry problems, and debate philosophy. Yet legally, they were still property. Educated slaves often wrote letters, kept accounts, and even drafted speeches for their masters. Some became indispensable, essentially running households or businesses behind the scenes. Yet, knowledge did not guarantee kindness. These slaves could be humiliated, punished, or dismissed at a whim. The paradox was painful. They could shape Rome's intellectual culture, but never claim it as their own. In the quiet corners of libraries, where slaves copied texts by hand, the words of wisdom that inspired emperors and senators were preserved, not by free citizens, but by those in chains. Slaves in agriculture, feeding the empire, beyond cities. The majority of Roman slaves toiled on vast agricultural estates known as lat. Here, men and women worked from sunrise to sunset in fields of grain, vineyards, and olive groves. Overseers whipped them to maintain pace, and their lives were harsh, repetitive, and short. The irony was that slaves produced the very food that fed Rome, yet often went hungry themselves. Bread, oil, and wine, the staples of Roman life, were cultivated by enslaved laborers who lived on meager rations of gruel. Agricultural slavery was relentless. Unlike in households, where slaves could sometimes carve out influence, field slaves were faceless and easily replaced. Their lives were closer to machines than people in the eyes of Roman society. The bounty of Roman feasts, the banquets of senators, and the spectacles of gladiators were all made possible by the suffering of those bent over in the fields. The laws of chains, Rome's legal codes on slavery. Roman law codified the institution of slavery with chilling precision. Slaves were considered race, property, not persons. This meant they could not marry legally, own property, or testify in court. If their masters committed crimes, slaves could even be punished in their place. At times, laws leaned toward cruelty. One statute dictated that if a master was murdered, all of his household slaves could be executed, regardless of guilt. Another allowed owners to kill their slaves without legal consequence. Though public outrage sometimes curbed excesses, yet law also provided rare paths to manumission contracts. Testamentary freedom, or reward for loyalty, could allow slaves to be freed. Some even became Roman citizens afterward. The paradox of Roman law was clear. It acknowledged slaves in order to control them, not to protect them. In the eyes of the state, they were tools, not humans. Slaves in Roman medicine and body care. Beyond physicians, many slaves specialized in health and body care. Some were masseurs, trained to soothe the aching muscles of senators after long days in the forum. Others became bath attendants, managing the fires that heated Rome's massive bathhouses, or scrubbing their masters' bodies clean with strigials. Wealthy Romans even used slaves as living mirrors. Female attendants stood by with cosmetics, adjusting hairstyles and applying perfumes to their mistresses. Male slaves oiled and perfumed their masters before public appearances. This care was intimate and humiliating. Slaves touched every detail of their masters' bodies, but their own bodies were neglected. Their health mattered only insofar as it affected their usefulness. In a society obsessed with appearances, slaves were the invisible hands making beauty possible. Slaves in Roman commerce. The business of chains. Slavery was not just personal servitude, it was also big business. Slaves staffed shops, sold goods in markets, and managed entire trade operations. A skilled slave might oversee shipping ventures, calculate accounts, and negotiate deals, all on behalf of a master who claimed the profits. In some cases, slaves were allowed to hold a peculium, a small allowance they could save. With luck, years of careful savings might one day buy their freedom, but even this was precarious. The peculium legally still belonged to the master, who could seize it at any time. Commerce revealed the hypocrisy of Rome. Slaves powered the economy, yet were excluded from its rewards. They created wealth that made Rome rich, yet could not legally possess a single coin of it. Whispered rebellions, subtle acts of resistance. While major slave uprisings, like Spartacus's revolt, shook Rome, most resistance happened quietly, in daily acts of defiance. Slaves might break tools, work slowly, or forget instructions. Others whispered satire behind their masters' backs, mocking their arrogance in songs or jokes. Some stole food or wine, redistributing scraps to fellow slaves. Poisonings, arson, and sabotage occasionally erupted, often disguised as accidents. Household slaves sometimes used gossip to undermine their masters, planting seeds of discord within elite families. These acts rarely changed the system, but they preserved dignity. Resistance, however small, was a way of saying, "We are human. We will not be erased." Rome prided itself on control, but beneath the surface, every household and farm was filled with small rebellions. Flickers of humanity that refused to be extinguished. Slaves in Roman religion and ritual. Religion permeated every layer of Roman life, and slavery was no exception. Slaves were often forced to participate in household rituals. They tended the family's shrines, lit incense before the Lares' household gods, and offered food sacrifices on behalf of their masters. These acts were deeply symbolic. Slaves were the invisible hands, maintaining the sacred bond between gods and households. In some cases, entire temples were staffed by enslaved labor. They cleaned altars, carried sacred vessels, and even sang hymns during festivals. Yet, despite their presence in holy spaces, slaves themselves were excluded from genuine spiritual autonomy. But religion also offered moments of irony. Certain cults, like that of Isis or Mithras, welcomed slaves as equals in worship. In these underground circles, an enslaved person could stand beside a senator and share in ritual meals. A brief escape from rigid social hierarchies. The most curious paradox was Saturnalia, Rome's December festival, where masters and slaves reversed roles for a day. Slaves dined at tables, mocked their masters, and wore festive clothes. For 24 hours, chains loosened. But once the festival ended, reality returned, sharper than ever. Slaves in the Roman military machine. Although slaves were not typically frontline soldiers, Rome's military power leaned heavily on their labor. Slaves constructed fortifications, dug ditches, carried supplies, and built roads that stretched across Europe, Africa, and Asia. They marched behind legions, cooking, repairing equipment, and tending to animals. Without them, Rome's armies could not sustain long campaigns. Some slaves served as rowers in the navy, chained to benches and galleys. Their oars propelled warships across the Mediterranean, exhausting rhythmic labor where a single mistake could bring a whip. At times of desperation, Rome even armed slaves. During the Second Punic War, when Hannibal threatened Italy, thousands of slaves were promised freedom in exchange for military service. For these men, war was not about Rome's glory, but a chance to claw back their humanity. The legions marched under standards of discipline and honor, but behind their victories were countless enslaved hands, unseen in the histories of triumph. The household spies, slaves as informants and tools of control. In elite Roman households, slaves were not only laborers but also instruments of surveillance. Masters relied on them to report whispers, keep track of guest behavior, and even spy on other slaves. A trusted servant might sit quietly in the corner of a banquet, listening to conversations between senators, absorbing secrets to be passed on later. Some slaves were forced to betray their fellow servants. Masters used fear to pit them against one another, rewarding loyalty with small privileges. Others were compelled to testify against household members, a dangerous duty that could end in retaliation from peers. This atmosphere of suspicion turned households into cages of paranoia. Slaves could not trust one another, nor could their masters ever feel secure. A servant pouring wine might also be listening. A nursemaid might also be watching. Ironically, this dynamic sometimes backfired. Slaves who gained access to secrets could wield quiet power, blackmailing their masters or leveraging information for better treatment. In Rome, knowledge was dangerous, even for those in chains. Slaves in Roman festivals, performers, laborers, and pawns. Rome's grand festivals dazzled citizens with games, feasts, and parades. But behind the spectacle were slaves. They prepared arenas, cleaned the blood after gladiatorial games, and herded animals for wild beast hunts. Some were forced into the role of bestia, dressing as mythological characters before being killed by lions or burned alive as part of theatrical executions. Others served as living decorations. Banquet halls might be filled with slaves, painted gold or dressed as gods, standing silently as ornaments. At feasts, they poured endless wine and carried trays heavy with roasted meats. Festivals offered moments of cruel irony. While the free Roman crowd roared with joy, slaves endured exhaustion, humiliation, and even death. Yet, some seized the opportunity for small rebellions, stealing food during feasts, whispering insults under the cover of music, or slipping away in the chaos of crowded arenas. For slaves, festivals were not moments of joy, but reminders of their expendability and the twisted entertainment Rome demanded at their expense. The world of mining slaves. Darkness beneath Rome. Among the harshest fates a slave could face was being sent to the mines. Roman mines, scattered across Spain, Gaul, and Dacia, were pits of despair. Slaves worked in near-total darkness, digging for gold, silver, and iron with crude tools. Air was foul, collapses were frequent, and exhaustion claimed lives daily. Mining slaves were branded for identification, ensuring they could never escape unnoticed. They lived underground for months, chained together, eating meager rations, and rarely seeing sunlight. Unlike household slaves, who sometimes carved out influence, miners were seen as utterly disposable. Their life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. To Rome, their suffering was worth it. Mines funded the empire's coins, weapons, and luxury goods. These underground laborers were ghosts of Rome's wealth. Every glittering coin bore silent testimony to those buried alive in tunnels of stone. Slaves and Roman punishments and executions. Rome's appetite for cruelty extended to how it punished slaves. Executions of slaves were often public, designed to terrify others. Crucifixion was common. Bodies nailed to wooden crosses along roadsides, left to rot as warnings. Others were burned alive, drowned in sacks with snakes, or torn apart by beasts in the Colosseum. Sometimes, slaves were forced to enact mythological punishments in theaters. For example, a slave might play the role of Icarus, only to be flung from a high platform to his death. Another might play Hercules, burned alive to mirror the hero's fiery end. Even minor disobedience could mean savage beatings or branding. Rome ensured its slaves lived in constant fear, their bodies marked with scars of obedience. Yet executions also revealed Rome's anxiety. The brutality was not only punishment, but a warning, a constant reminder that beneath Rome's grandeur lurked the possibility of revolt. Slaves in Roman households of power, senators, and emperors. The higher the master, the greater the stakes for their slaves. In the homes of senators and emperors, slaves lived at the center of politics. They carried letters, overheard conspiracies, and sometimes became pawns in deadly struggles for power. A whisper from a slave could shift alliances. A poisoned cup could topple a dynasty. Emperors in particular surrounded themselves with armies of slaves, from bodyguards to personal attendants. Some, like the infamous freedman Narcissus under Emperor Claudius, wielded immense power after manumission. Others were executed the moment they became inconvenient. Life in these households was a paradox. On one hand, it offered access to wealth, luxury, and influence. On the other, it was a tightrope of danger. A single mistake could mean ruin. In Rome's corridors of power, slaves were both shadows and silent architects of history. The art of branding and marking slaves. Rome had many ways of reminding slaves of their status, but few were as dehumanizing as branding. Runaway slaves often had letters burned into their foreheads, such as FUG, fugitivus, fugitive. These scars permanently marked them as property, denying them the possibility of anonymity or reinvention. Others were forced to wear collars inscribed with humiliating messages. I am a slave. Capture me if I flee. These collars were chains of shame, visible to all who passed by. Branding ensured that slavery was not just a condition, but a permanent identity. Even freed slaves carried the marks of their past, scars on their skin that no legal manumission could erase. For Rome, branding was efficiency. For the enslaved, it was a theft of self. A declaration burned into flesh that said, "You are not your own." Slaves in Roman love and marriage. Though slaves were denied legal marriage, their emotional lives could not be erased. Many formed deep bonds, marrying in unofficial ceremonies called contubernium. These unions were not recognized by law, but they were real to the people living them. Children born of these relationships were also slaves, perpetuating the cycle. Love among slaves was fragile. Masters could separate couples at any moment, selling one partner or both. Yet, despite this, bonds endured. Archaeological records show graves where slaves were buried side by side, a quiet testament to affection in a world of cruelty. Ironically, some masters exploited these unions, encouraging them to breed new generations of slaves. Others used them as tools of control, threatening to break couples apart to enforce obedience. Love in chains was both a rebellion and a tragedy, a fragile flame burning against the storm of Roman power. The afterlives of slaves, memory, burial, and legacy. What happened to slaves after death reveals much about their humanity. Most were buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by history, yet some masters allowed slaves modest tombstones, often inscribed with brief epitaphs. These inscriptions reveal names, roles, and sometimes touching glimpses of personality. To Chloe, who sang sweetly, or to Felix, who was loyal. Freedmen, once slaves, often built elaborate tombs, celebrating their rise. They depicted themselves as dignified citizens, sometimes including references to their past servitude as a reminder of their triumph. Even in death, however, the divide lingered. Rome's grand mausoleums honored emperors and generals, while countless enslaved lives vanished without trace. And yet, through fragments of epitaphs, artifacts, and whispered stories, the voices of the enslaved echo faintly, proof that even Rome's might could not fully erase their existence. The slave market, Rome's theater of flesh. Imagine stepping into the slave market of Rome, not just a place of trade, but a grotesque performance of human suffering. Slaves were paraded like livestock. Their bodies were inspected for scars, teeth, and strength. Some were stripped naked, forced to stand on raised platforms while auctioneers announced their qualities. Strong arms, good for the fields. Or educated, can read Greek. Others had signs hung around their necks, listing defects. Prone to illness, prone to theft. Foreign captives were especially excised. Blonde-haired Gauls or red-headed Britons fetched high prices, while educated Greek slaves were prized as tutors. Children were sold for domestic service, their small hands perfect for delicate tasks. The cruelty was not only physical but psychological. Families were torn apart, sold to different masters, never to see each other again. Mothers begged for their children, only to be dragged away in chains. For Rome, the market was efficient. For the enslaved, it was the first taste of despair and a life of servitude, and for many, the moment their identities were stripped away and replaced by a price tag. Slaves as financial investments and status symbols. To Roman elites, slaves were not just workers, they were investments and badges of wealth. Owning a large household of slaves was a display of prestige. Senators and equestrians competed over who had the most attendants, sometimes keeping hundreds for tasks as trivial as standing guard at doorways or fanning guests at banquets. Pliny the Elder mocked such extravagance, noting that some men needed slaves just to carry their scented oils. Slaves could even appreciate in value. A Greek philosopher enslaved in war might later be worth a fortune as a tutor. A skilled artisan or physician was considered more valuable than gold. Rich Romans often gave slaves as gifts, much like luxury items today. Imagine presenting a friend not with a fine bottle of wine, but with a living, breathing person. A chilling reminder of how commodified human life was. The wealthiest citizens saw slaves not just as labor, but as ornaments of status. To walk into a villa staffed by dozens of slaves in colorful tunics was to announce, "I am powerful. I own people." The slave overseers, whips, power, and fear. Among slaves, one of the most despised figures was the villicus, the overseer, often a slave himself. The overseer was tasked with controlling others. On farms, he managed field slaves, enforcing quotas, distributing rations, and administering punishments. In mines, he kept order with lash and chain. Even in cities, household overseers kept watch on kitchens, storerooms, and other workers. The overseer lived in a strange limbo. On one hand, he wielded terrifying authority over fellow slaves, sometimes enjoying privileges and better food. On the other, he was still a slave, utterly dependent on his master's favor. This position bred resentment. Overseers were often hated more than the masters themselves, seen as traitors who turned against their own kind. In moments of rebellion, they were frequently the first targets of violence. For Rome, the overseer was an efficient tool, one who could enforce control without the master's constant presence. For slaves, he was both a tormentor and a reminder that in Rome, even small scraps of power came at the cost of betraying one's own. Slaves and Roman food culture. Food was at the heart of Roman identity, and slaves were essential to its production and consumption. In the countryside, agricultural slaves toiled in vineyards, olive groves, and wheat fields, producing the staples that fed the empire. They harvested grapes for wine, pressed olives for oil, and threshed grain for bread. Without them, Rome's famous feasts would have been impossible. In urban households, kitchen slaves became experts in culinary arts. Wealthy masters demanded exotic dishes, flamingo tongues, stuffed dormice, honeyed fish, and it was slaves who prepared these meals. Cooks risked severe punishment if dishes displeased their masters, yet successful chefs could become highly valued. At banquets, slaves served food in elaborate courses, carving meat at the table or pouring imported wines. They ate scraps left behind, rarely tasting the luxuries they prepared. Food was both nourishment and symbol. For free Romans, dining was an act of status. For slaves, it was a reminder of division. Their labor filled the plates of others. While their own meals were little more than coarse bread and porridge, children born into slavery, a life decided at birth. One of the cruelest aspects of Roman slavery was its inheritance. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically slaves, no matter the father's status. This meant entire generations lived and died in bondage, their lives determined at birth by the womb they came from. These children were put to work young. Some became household servants, others field laborers. Their small bodies were exploited for delicate tasks, weaving fine cloth, polishing ornaments, or cleaning narrow spaces. Mothers faced an agonizing reality. Their children could be sold at any time. Families were torn apart with brutal efficiency, leaving parents in grief and children in terror. Yet, enslaved children also found ways to resist. They built secret friendships, learned songs, and carried whispered stories of freedom. Some masters allowed them limited education, inadvertently giving them tools for future survival. Rome thrived on this generational slavery, but for the enslaved, each birth was both a miracle of life and a fresh chain added to humanity's long bondage. Slaves in Roman agriculture, the silent backbone of the empire. If Rome was fed by its fields, then those fields were worked by slaves. The empire's agricultural wealth depended on latifundia, vast estates owned by elites, and it was here that slaves toiled from dawn to dusk. Under the Mediterranean sun, they harvested wheat, olives, and grapes, often chained together in fields to prevent escape. Overseers carried whips, ensuring no hand slowed. Unlike household slaves who might gain small privileges, agricultural slaves lived in brutal conditions. Their quarters were little more than wooden huts or even caves, packed with bodies and plagued by disease. Food was minimal, a handful of grain or beans, and life expectancy was heartbreakingly short. And yet, agriculture was the foundation of Rome's power. Every loaf of bread baked in the city, every amphora of wine exported across the empire, bore the unseen fingerprints of enslaved laborers who rarely survived to taste the fruits of their work. Slaves and Roman transportation, moving the empire. Rome's roads were legendary, but who actually traveled them? More often than not, slaves, carts loaded with goods, were driven by enslaved men. Pack animals were led by slaves across mountain passes and scorching plains. In bustling ports, slave dock workers carried amphorae of wine and oil, straining under crushing loads. Others rowed the massive cargo ships that linked Rome to its provinces, pulling oars in grueling rhythm. Even wealthy travelers were accompanied by enslaved porters carrying luggage, food, and even portable furniture. A Roman noble on a journey moved in comfort only because slaves trudged beside them, bearing the weight. Transportation made Rome global, a network stretching from Britain to Syria. But the lifeblood of this system wasn't just trade, it was enslaved human bodies, moving both goods and empire itself. Slaves in Roman domestic spying and secrets. In elite Roman households, slaves did more than sweep floors and pour wine. They were also silent witnesses. A slave stationed behind a curtain might overhear political conspiracies. Another, tasked with attending to the master's bedchamber, might know of forbidden affairs. Some were deliberately used as informants, reporting back to masters about the words and actions of wives, children, or fellow slaves. This created an atmosphere of paranoia. Romans trusted their slaves with their most intimate moments, yet feared their potential betrayal. Legal records even mention cases of slaves testifying against their masters in court, their words carrying deadly consequences. And, of course, the slaves themselves carried secrets of their own. Gossip whispered in kitchens, scandals traded in servants' quarters. If written down, these stories would have revealed Rome's true underbelly, a shadow history known only to the enslaved. The economy of slave rentals in Rome. Not every Roman could afford to own a slave, but that didn't mean they couldn't use one. A vast rental market existed. Need extra hands for harvest? Rent 10 slaves from a wealthy owner, hosting a banquet, hire a few skilled cooks or entertainers. Even builders could hire out slaves trained in masonry, carpentry, or metalwork. For owners, renting slaves was profitable. For the enslaved, it meant constant displacement. A man might serve one master during planting season, another during winter, and yet another in the city for festivals. This practice blurred the line between property and worker. Slaves were shuffled from task to task, treated not even as possessions of one household, but as interchangeable tools for the highest bidder. It was another layer of dehumanization, one where even stability of servitude was denied. Slaves in Roman childhood, nannies, tutors, and surrogate parents. Roman children often grew up in the arms of slaves. Wealthy families relied on nutresses, enslaved wet nurses to breastfeed and raise infants. These women often developed deep emotional bonds with the children they raised, though they remained legally property, not family. In fact, Some Roman writers admitted that children loved their nurses more than their own parents. Older children were taught by enslaved tutors, often educated Greeks. They taught reading, writing, and philosophy, shaping the next generation of senators and generals. Some children's very first words and values came from the lips of enslaved people. And yet, when those children grew up, many treated these surrogate parents as expendable property. A slave who nurtured a Roman boy might one day be ordered, flogged by that same boy as a man. It was a tragic cycle of intimacy and betrayal, one that reveals how deeply slavery was woven into the personal lives of Roman families. Slaves and the Roman concept of honor. Honor was a cornerstone of Roman identity, but slaves, by law, were excluded from it. Slaves could not testify in court unless tortured, since their word was considered unreliable. They could not wear the toga, the garment of free men, nor could they hold public office or serve in the army. Their very existence was seen as dishonorable, a living opposite of what Romans claimed to value. Yet ironically, slaves were essential to maintaining Roman honor. They dressed their masters, polished their armor, carried their standards, and built the monuments that celebrated Roman glory. This paradox was clear in triumphal processions. Victorious generals rode through Rome in splendor, but surrounding them were slaves who prepared costumes, held laurel crowns, and led sacrificial animals. Honor for the master meant humiliation for the slave. Rome's obsession with honor depended on slavery, a system that declared some lives noble while ensuring others could never escape shame. Slaves and the Roman economy of luxury. Rome's elites were addicted to luxury, and slaves were the invisible engines behind it. Luxury goods, silks from the East, spices from India, ivory from Africa, required enslaved labor at every step. Slaves carried caravans, loaded ships, and transported goods into Rome's bustling markets. Once in the city, slaves became curators of luxury. Jewelers' shops, staffed by skilled enslaved artisans, produced fine gold and silver ornaments. Textile slaves wove intricate fabrics, while household slaves polished marble statues or arranged exotic flowers for display. The sheer extravagance of Rome's villas was built upon their toil. Water features, mosaics, and heated baths were all maintained by enslaved workers. For masters, these luxuries were symbols of refinement. For slaves, they were endless tasks that brought no pleasure. Rome's hunger for excess was insatiable, and slaves were both producers and unseen victims of that appetite. Slaves as cultural intermediaries. Slavery in Rome was not just about labor, it also shaped culture itself. Enslaved Greeks introduced Romans to philosophy, theater, and literature. Tutors taught wealthy Roman children Homer, Plato, and Aristotle, embedding Greek thought into Roman society. Without enslaved intellectuals, Rome's cultural development would have been far slower. Slaves from the East brought religious practices, rituals, and even culinary traditions. Dishes flavored with Eastern spices or worship of foreign gods often arrived through the presence of enslaved peoples. This made slaves both invisible and influential. They were cultural transmitters, their forced displacement creating bridges between civilizations, yet their names are mostly lost, erased from the history they helped shape. Rome prided itself on its cosmopolitan culture, but much of that richness flowed through enslaved voices, unheard but indispensable. The psychology of enslavement. Living without a self, perhaps the most haunting aspect of slavery was not the labor, but the erosion of identity. Slaves were stripped of names, given new ones by their masters. They were denied control over their bodies, movements, and even thoughts. Daily humiliation chipped away at selfhood, replacing I am with I belong. Roman writers often describe slaves as tools, not people. Animated property. Imagine living each day, being told you were no more than a plow or a jug. Over time, some internalized this role, while others resisted silently through small acts of defiance. Psychological survival required immense strength. Some found meaning in friendships, religion, or quiet acts of rebellion. Others collapsed into despair. Rome's genius was not only in conquest but in reshaping human beings into instruments. The psychological chains, as much as the iron ones, bound slaves to their fate. The legacy of Roman slavery. The story of Roman slavery did not end with the fall of the empire. The systems Rome perfected, mass enslavement through conquest, markets of human flesh, branding, and generational bondage, influenced later civilizations. From medieval serfdom to the Atlantic slave trade, echoes of Rome's cruelty resounded for centuries. Roman slavery also left a cultural paradox. On one hand, Rome gave the world art, architecture, and law. On the other, those achievements were built on suffering. The Colosseum, aqueducts, and roads remain standing, silent monuments to invisible hands. Today, studying Roman slavery forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Civilization often advances not through justice, but through exploitation. Rome's greatness was inseparable from its brutality. For the slaves, their legacy was resilience. Though most names are lost, their survival, labor, and quiet humanity remain etched into history's foundation. They remind us that even in the darkest systems, human dignity flickers, fragile but never fully extinguished. Slaves and Roman religion, sacred and profane. Religion touched every aspect of Roman life, and slavery was no exception. In temples, slaves performed critical but invisible roles. They cleaned altars, prepared offerings, and tended sacred fires. Some were assistants to priests, carrying ritual objects or leading sacrificial animals. Their labor allowed Rome's elite to appear pious without dirtying their hands. Ironically, while Rome's religion reinforced hierarchy, it also offered moments of inversion. During festivals like Saturnalia, masters served slaves at banquets. For a single day, the enslaved could mock their superiors, wear their clothes, and speak freely. But when dawn came, the illusion shattered, and chains returned heavier than before. Some cults, especially foreign ones, welcomed slaves as full participants. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, embraced followers regardless of status, giving enslaved worshippers a rare sense of equality before the divine. For many, religion was less about ritual and more about hope. The hope that beyond Rome's chains, there might be a realm of freedom. Slaves in Roman entertainment beyond the arena? When we think of slaves in Roman entertainment, gladiators dominate the image. But the spectacle went much further. In theaters, slaves worked backstage, moving props, preparing costumes, even acting minor roles. Some were trained as performers, dancers, singers, or mimes, entertaining crowds for their master's profit. Their artistry was admired, yet their humanity ignored. At private banquets, masters used slaves as living amusements. Some were forced to recite poetry, juggle, or play instruments. Others were humiliated, made to dance in ridiculous costumes or endure cruel jokes for guests' laughter. Even in chariot racing, the most popular sport of Rome, slaves played crucial roles as stable hands, mechanics, and sometimes drivers. While famous charioteers could earn fame and fortune, many remained property, their victories enriching their masters rather than themselves. Entertainment in Rome was dazzling, but behind the applause was a hidden world of enforced labor and humiliation, where the joy of the free was purchased by the suffering of the enslaved. Slaves in Roman medicine and science. Roman advances in medicine and science often came at the expense of slaves. Doctors, many of them enslaved Greeks, treated citizens while themselves living under chains. Skilled medical slaves could rise to relative comfort, but their knowledge was never fully their own. It belonged to their masters. Worse still, slaves were sometimes the subjects of medical experimentation. Physicians such as Galen conducted dissections and surgeries on enslaved bodies, often without consent, in the name of science. For the enslaved, illness was rarely treated with compassion. Their health mattered only insofar as it preserved their value as laborers. In wealthy households, slaves acted as nurses, midwives, and healers for both free and enslaved populations. They dispensed remedies, applied poultices, and even delivered babies. Yet their own access to care was minimal. Rome prided itself on rational knowledge, but much of its progress was written not in ink, but in the suffering of enslaved flesh. Slaves in Roman warfare beyond the battlefield. Rome's legions were legendary, but behind every soldier marched enslaved laborers. Slaves carried weapons, tended horses, built camps, and cooked meals. They followed armies across continents, ensuring soldiers could focus on fighting. Some were tasked with looting conquered cities, hauling treasures and captives back to Rome. Others endured the most grueling work, digging fortifications, building siege engines, and transporting supplies. In war, they were everywhere, but rarely remembered. Occasionally, desperate generals armed slaves in battle. During crises, entire units of enslaved men were promised freedom if they fought bravely. For some, this gamble paid off. For others, it ended in betrayal, as promises of manumission evaporated after victory. Rome's military machine was not just a story of legionaries and generals, it was also a story of invisible slaves, trudging in the dust, carrying the empire's conquests on their backs. The forgotten voices of Roman slavery? The greatest tragedy of Roman slavery is silence. We know of it mostly through the voices of masters, Cicero, Seneca, Pliny, men who wrote about their slaves as property. The voices of the enslaved themselves are almost entirely lost, erased by time and power, and yet, fragments remain. Graffiti scrawled on walls, small inscriptions on tombstones, names in faded records. These are whispers of humanity struggling to be remembered. A slave might write, "I was here." Another might inscribe a simple plea, "I lived. Remember me?" These fragments remind us that behind statistics and systems were people, with loves, fears, and dreams. They sang songs, told stories, and imagined futures, even when denied them. In remembering them today, we restore a sliver of their dignity. Rome wanted them forgotten, but history still listens. So now you've seen what it was like to be a slave in ancient Rome, a world of chains and humiliation, but also resilience and survival. From markets where people were sold like animals, to kitchens where they cooked feasts they'd never taste, to tombs where only their first names remained, Roman slaves shaped the empire in silence. Rome's glory rested on their backs. Its culture, wealth, and monuments were born of their labor. And though most of their voices are gone, we remember them not as shadows, but as human beings who endured the unimaginable. If you found this journey eye-opening, here's what you can do. Hit like so this story of the forgotten reaches more people. Subscribe to Weird History Secrets for more deep dives into the hidden, bizarre, and haunting sides of history. And let me know in the comments, which part of Roman slavery shocked you the most? Thank you for staying with me through this long exploration. Until next time, remember, history isn't just kings and empires. It's also the millions of unseen lives that made those empires possible.